told you were going to be an MBIT. Marianna, why don't we start with you and we'll go down the line.
Sure. So I'm Marianna Sotomayor. I grew up in Tampa, Florida. And politics was always around me. I didn't know that that is a world that I wanted to venture into, but I always tell the story of how my parents always had the nightly news, and it's funny, we would always watch NBC, and that's where I am now. That was something that was always very prominent in my life, and my dad would always have Newsweek magazines. The news in general was always around me. Knowing what was happening was very important to my parents and to me as well. And I think just down the line, I really liked writing, but when I was younger, I thought I was going to be a dancer, and then I figured, no, I don't think that's going to be the path for me, so let's pursue this writing thing. And just so happened right before I went to college, I wanted to follow that political journalism route. I was like, okay, I like to write. I think I can do this. And I think being a political journalist, you have a responsibility to inform. And I found that to be a calling, basically. You really just want to be able to tell people what's happening and do it diligently. So then I went to George Washington University, which is where I graduated from. And from there, started off at NBC. I actually had not interned there or anything at all. Just happened to get a job as the Tim Russert Fellow, which allows someone straight out of college to rotate around Meet the Press, the political unit, and also the assignment desk. And that was right in 2016 when no one really cared about Congress because the focus was on the 2016 election, so they sent me up there to kind of fill in the gaps. And it's kind of funny looking at it now. A couple of my friends have been saying today, I think the roles have flipped. Maybe now all the attention is going to be on Congress and not necessarily the election. I don't know if that's the case, but I was on Capitol Hill for a couple of years, covered a lot of the investigations, big votes, and that actually taught me a lot. Both how to prepare logistically for the campaign trail and also editorially kind of understanding what the big news is and obviously feeding that information to all of the network's entities.
Moose?
Hi, everyone. My name is Musadiq Bidar. I go by Moose for short. It's a little easier for people to remember at times. So I never thought I'd be here. I was born in Kabul, Afghanistan. Left in the summer of 1996 when the Taliban took over, immigrated to Pakistan, lived in refugee camps for a while, moved to Islamabad eventually with my family, started working at a carpet factory. I was spending 10, 12-hour days making carpets, some of the really nice ones that some of you may have at your homes. And eventually applied for a refugee status visa through the United Nations, was referred to the American Embassy, and summer of 2003, May 8th, 2003, I still remember that day, moved to the United States. We were placed in Glendale, Arizona. When you imagine America, you don't always imagine Glendale, Arizona as the place you're going to end up being. So you're coming in on that flight and you see the desert and you're like, this is interesting. This is not the big buildings and the green fields that I imagined. But my mom had some friends in the Bay Area in California. And after a couple of months, we packed our bags and took that 14-hour drive up to California. And that's where things kind of got started for me. I went to school for the first time, started in middle school, didn't know a word of English, but was really hungry to learn and to catch up to everybody. And I had the right support system around me, my parents and other family members, and from tutors and teachers and friends in school who wanted to help out, and that meant a lot to me. Went to high school in the Bay Area as well, and then actually went to GW as well. One of my family friends, her son was at Georgetown, and she was going back for back to school night or freshman parents' school night, whatever, and asked me if I wanted to visit Washington, D.C. And I had never been to D.C. I was very excited by the idea, and I walked around GW and fell in love right there, made up my mind, applied early decision, and I knew I wanted to be in journalism. It was just like, it clicked right there. Just kind of walking around those streets in DC. I wanted to be in a big city, Also wanted to get away from my parents for a little bit. So it was nice to go 3,000 miles away. I don't know. They're still trying to get me to come back. We'll see what happens after this. But my father was also a radio journalist. He was a radio producer when we lived in Kabul, so journalism's kind of always been in my blood. Did a couple of internships at CBS News, and when I was graduating, I went back knocking on that door, and I told them, "You're going to hire me, or I'm standing here striking." CBS News has a similar program to the Russert Fellowship, where you do, it's called the News Associate Program. You do 3 months on the different shows. I started with the morning show, really enjoyed working with the team there, enjoyed the opportunities that I was getting, and within a few months, a full-time position opened up. I was soon promoted to associate producer, where I was working overnight, which was tough. I was going in at 6 in the evening and working through 4 or 5 in the morning. Had a lot of pasta at 6 in the morning for dinner, which I love. I love pasta. It was great. So that when I started in 2015, they had just assigned the campaign reporters for that cycle, and seeing how excited everybody was to do that job and the opportunities that they were getting, I told myself 4 years from now, I got to be in a position where I can do that. And so I focused on learning how to write, learning how to produce, being comfortable in the field, and just kind of getting to know everybody's different jobs. Being comfortable in the edit room and being comfortable working with correspondents, because that's a lot of what this role is now, is kind of imagining what somebody on the other end needs, and having gone through the control room, having gone through field producing, having written a lot of packages, it's a lot easier for me to anticipate what somebody in New York or DC might need. And at the end of the day, that's really what you're trying to do. You want to be a good teammate, and you want to make sure that somebody can get what they need. And so when fall of or early 2019 came around, I thought about this for about a week. Wasn't sure if I wanted to give up nearly 2 years of my life being on the road, but then I thought about it and said, if I don't do it, somebody else will. So why not me? And applied and went ahead, and I love it. It's been a great experience, and I'm happy to be here tonight.
Chelsea.
I took the usual route to this job, which is that I covered baseball for 4 years before this. I grew up in Western Massachusetts, actually. I went to school at Yale, played softball pretty badly there, took some languages, studied history, wasn't entirely sure where that was going to lead me, but I knew I liked to write. And at the time, I was kind of engrossed in sports, and I happened to get my first internship writing about sports, and kind of carried me from there. It seemed like fun, and so I ended up back at the Post in 2013 as a sports intern, and from there I ended up covering the Washington Nationals for 4 years until last year, at which point I think it's hard to be in DC and at the Washington Post and around people like Dan and reading all that work, and especially at a time like this when politics have sort of seized everyone's attention. It was kind of hard to sit there and be at a baseball field sometimes, as much as I loved it, and not be a part of that. So early last season, I still think of life in baseball seasons, I think, but I was asked, what would you think of being in Iowa in 2019? And it was something, January of 2019, and I think Iowa in January is not something that you immediately jump at. And I think it took me a minute to process what was meant by that, and it was such an honor to be asked to do that, and something that I just could never have imagined doing. And as someone who enjoys reading about history and paying attention to what's happening in the world, but had never had the opportunity to really engage with it and be a part of it, it just felt like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and a chance to write about things that really mattered. And it has definitely been that. And I was used to traveling for baseball, and this was just supposed to just be a little bit more travel. It has been significantly more travel. But it's a great way to see the country, and fallen in love with Des Moines, as we all have, I'm sure. So here I am, and it's been an incredible honor.
Chelsea was a superb baseball writer, and we did not meet until she moved over to do politics. But I remember there was one night, sometime late in the season, and she was writing the game story day after day after day, which is much harder than you might think. And she did it wonderfully. And one night I just sent her an email and I said, you're in an otherwise disappointing season for the Nationals. Your coverage is spectacular. And then I realized that we were trying to recruit her to cover politics. So I thought this is the perfect training just to watch the Nationals 162 times a year. Now she's going to listen to the same speech from a candidate 162 times and try to make that interesting. So I want to talk a little bit about the state of play. As I said at the top, we don't know where the impeachment story is going, but we know that it's going to dominate everything for a time and probably for a considerable amount of time. There's a lot that we don't know yet about what happened, and the unfolding of this will come in a contentious environment. But let's go back 2 days ago or thereabouts and talk about where the Democratic race was just before we got into this. Moose, let's start with you. There was a poll that came out in Iowa on Saturday night. Ann Seltzer is the best pollster in Iowa by far, and one of the best pollsters around anywhere. It showed movement in the race. Warren now up 2 points, statistical tie with Vice President Biden. Talk about what you have seen and the degree to which that poll either confirmed what you were seeing or surprised you.
I wasn't so surprised to see Senator Elizabeth Warren at the top of that poll. When I moved to Iowa in June, one of the first things that we kept hearing from everybody we talked to was the incredible ground game she's built there. From the number of staffers in the field, getting there early ahead of everybody else, and not just the quantity of staffers, the quality of staffers that they have, people who are experienced in Iowa politics, who know the different players in town, and they have just been going everywhere. The one thing that's very interesting is Senator Elizabeth Warren hasn't been in Iowa very much in the last 3-4 months that I've been there, but it's her team that's going around doing the door knocking. They're holding events. They're giving stump speeches that mirror her stump speech, and it's very impressive to see organizers and volunteers go out and do stuff like that. So she has been there for a while and has been playing the game really well. And every time you talk to voters, her name comes up a lot. Consistently, whether you're in the Des Moines area, around the big cities, or in some of the smaller towns, whether it's Alcater or Dubuque on the east side or Decorah, these small little towns, voters mention her name. So seeing her at the top of the poll wasn't very surprising. Seeing Mayor Pete Buttigieg also making that bit of a climb up there, not surprising as well. The names when I talk to voters that I consistently hear are Senator Elizabeth Warren, Vice President Biden, Mayor Buttigieg. Senator Sanders has somewhat of an advantage in Iowa because the people who did vote for him last time, he's got that base of support, but the challenge for him now is he's competing against so many other candidates, and a lot of that support is either going towards Senator Elizabeth Warren or going towards Mayor Pete Buttigieg. So while Senator Elizabeth Warren is at the top of the polls, the other thing that I am interested in that poll is who voters are actively considering. It's not just who their first choice is, but who's their second choice and their third choice. And in Iowa, that is important because of the way the caucuses work. If a candidate in any caucus needs to have 15% of the support in that room to be viable. And so if you're in a room of 100 people and 12 of them are supporting Senator Amy Klobuchar, for example, that candidate is not viable, and then you move on to your second choice or your third choice. So that's where the ground game that Senator Elizabeth Warren has comes into play, because those organizers have been in touch with all those caucus goers, and they can pull them over to gain that support. So it's seeing her at the top of the poll wasn't surprising. I'm curious to see how Vice President Biden is going to start fighting back on that. He did have somewhat of a late start to that ground game just because he got into the race a couple months later. And same thing, we hear about Mayor Pete Buttigieg, that maybe he might have had a bit of a late start. There was that CNN town hall in April where he kind of shot up in the polls, and a lot of people on the national stage saw him, but he didn't have that ground game in place. And that's really the important thing is some people will have that moment, but they won't have that ground game to capture that momentum. Whereas others, like Senator Cory Booker, has had a huge staff in Iowa, but he hasn't really had that one moment to kind of galvanize that support. So it kind of goes both ways. You gotta be careful about how much money you're spending on staff on the ground, and we're gonna see where some of these teams go now.
Marianna, can you talk about this moment for Vice President Biden? He's led in the polls throughout, but he's been criticized in a variety of ways for gaffes, many of them quite small, but nonetheless, as a front runner, he gets special scrutiny. Now he's in the middle of this Ukraine issue. How is he dealing with all of this? What do you see in terms of the way he or the campaign are adapting to these circumstances?
Well, I think from him, you're seeing a bit of frustration. I think he knew coming into this, a big thing that we reported before he even got into this race was he weighed the fact that Trump is going to go not only after him, but his family, right? And for him, family is everything. He talks about it very often in the campaign trail. He gets emotional still talking about his son, Beau Biden, just as recently as this past Friday. So this has taken on a new direction for him. It was expected, but I don't think he saw it coming this soon. And he's one, and he said it before, even talking about the debates. Listen, I want to talk about the issues. I really want to get down and dirty about all these little policy issues. And he even said this last debate, we were able to talk a bit more about healthcare. That finally felt like a debate. So this is definitely totally different territory for him, something that he is going to have to get a bit adjusted to, because this is going to be the new reality. You said it yourself. We are going to be asking him about this all the time. Every little incremental development we're going to have to ask him about. Just last week, we were standing outside right after the news broke that the Wall Street Journal had talked about how Trump pressed the Ukrainian president 8 times on these investigations into Biden. And we were told by the campaign that he was not going to gaggle being the word that we use very casually to mean just talking with reporters and talking back and forth and answering a couple questions. So what did we do? Okay, great, thanks, but we're going to wait outside of this door until he comes out to pepper him with questions. And that is a lot of what we have to do. And of course, that waiting game was, I think, around an hour, if not a little bit more than an hour. But that's our job. The news doesn't stop.
It's quite glamorous work.
It is very glamorous. A lot of people say, like, whoa, must be cool. No, when you're waiting outside in like 90-degree heat with a little bit of water, it's a little hard. But the news doesn't stop, and that's our responsibility, trying getting that reaction from him. And it's to your question about how the campaign is reacting to it. It was interesting until Biden actually came out and said on that day, just very briefly, we're still waiting to hear more. The campaign was, I think, waiting for that moment, right? Letting him speak, letting him comment, given that it is such a personal issue to him. But since then, I have not seen them on any issue before go on overdrive, blasting out emails to supporters, telling them to donate because this is one of the biggest political moments is how they're describing it, telling reporters, sending memos out to reporters saying this is fact, this is fiction, when Trump or one of his allies goes on TV and on Twitter as well. They're blasting this, they're trying to put their spin on the narrative as quickly as possible because they know they're going up against President Donald Trump, who just tweets by himself and every tweet more or less gets covered. So it is new terrain for them. I think it may have come earlier than they thought it would, and the element that this is now impeachment grounds, right? Or we're likely going to these impeachment proceedings. That's different. I don't think they were necessarily expecting that this early.
So Chelsea, you have spent time with a number of candidates, but a lot of time with Kamala Harris, and now you're moving over to do some more with Senator Sanders. Talk about what's happened to both of those candidates as you've watched them. And Senator Harris had a great first debate, got a lot of attention out of it, popped up in the polls has fallen back. Talk about the degree to which that looks like a campaign that's either struggling or finding footing. And similarly with Senator Sanders, Moose made the comment that he's got a base of support, and yet he's not been able to expand on that, and in some ways he's slipped. So what have you seen?
You know, they're two very different people, obviously, which I think has helped me get a different perspective on both of them. But one of the things that has been really interesting with Senator Harris, as I'm sure you all know, is, you know, she had the huge launch. I think it was 22,000 people in Oakland. She was sort of seemingly on paper built for the moment, right? You know, a woman of color at a time when, you know, there's so much clamoring for some of these inequities of gender and race to be fixed. You know, she's got the personality, you know, the sense of humor, really made a name for herself in all those Senate hearings as someone who can be forceful and just a presence. And so on paper, you look at that and say, wow, this is someone that will be formidable. And I think what we've seen is, I think somewhat surprisingly, you know, that she's sort of been lost in the shuffle, which I'm new to this, what do I know? But I certainly didn't necessarily expect. And in watching that firsthand, what's really stood out to me, and I think people with far more experience than me have said many times, is that, you know, the message just isn't clear. And I think what you're seeing now, you know, in a lot of these people that are really gaining ground, and I think particularly Senator Warren, is it's very clear what she stands for. And whether you agree with it or not, it's a known commodity, right? You know her purpose. It hasn't changed. You know what 2 cents means. You know who she is. And I don't think Senator Harris ever really found, or has found, because it's certainly not over, had the message that really sticks with you. And that's something I've heard from voters all around the country. You know, we really like her, which is a good thing. You know, there's a lot of candidates that people come into and don't like. And that's why it's sort of hard for me to write her off entirely, because I think there's people that are very open to her. But it just seems like she's tried to kind of thread this middle needle where, you know, originally she was for Medicare for all, then she decided to introduce her own plan to sort of try to keep private insurance involved. And anytime I think, you know, especially when you have people like Sanders and Warren, whose positions are just so clear and their stated purpose is so well known. Anytime you start shifting, fairly or not, you look non-committal. You look like you don't know why you're there. And I think she probably does know why she's here. I think she really wants, you know, I think there are clear intentions there that she hasn't been able to articulate, but or at least articulate consistently enough. But for me, I think that's been the really interesting thing to watch, is how important it is to have people know who you are, not just your name, you know, but what your agenda is. And I think in Biden, in Warren, and Sanders, you know that. And I don't think it's coincidental then that in this moment where there's so much sort of distrust and uncertainty about the people in these roles, that people are really looking for those characters. That being said, that hasn't, you know, helped Sanders, I think, a lot, in that he hasn't been able to build on the following that he had. You know, I think his problem is that he's, you know, I had a voter say it perfectly to me the other day, that, you know, you're not losing a lot in policy when you consider Elizabeth Warren over Bernie Sanders, and you're gaining a lot in, you know, a woman. A lot of people think it's time for a woman. A lot of Democratic voters have said that. You know, you're gaining someone different, someone with a slightly different message, a different, you know, vibe, for lack of a better word. So I think he's having trouble convincing people that he's the, you know, the change they need, when he's, you know, frankly, an older white guy who's been around a while. And Elizabeth Warren, while at times it feels like she's been around a while, really hasn't, and it has a different story. So, you know, for him, that sort of authentic message is, it hasn't, you know, allowed him to build. And it just feels like, you know, whenever there's a good moment for him, there's also Warren, and he hasn't been able to overcome that. And I think his campaign is grappling with that at times more combatively than others.
What are these candidates like behind the scenes? I mean, obviously they're not as accessible as you all may think they are, but you are as close to these candidates as any three people in the country. How much do you see them? How friendly are they? How standoffish are they? How combative are they? How different are they?
We see them a lot. I think, especially in Iowa, you know, they by now, because they see me everywhere, they recognize me, they know my name. I always have a red CBS hat on, which makes it easy to point you out when you're in different places. So sometimes I'll throw them off and I'll wear a blue CBS hat. But they, after a gaggle, after they speak to you, they ask you how you're doing, what's going on. Like a couple weeks ago, I went home and I surprised my parents, and I made a little video out of it and I put it on Twitter. On Sunday, I was with Julian Castro, and afterwards he's like, hey, I saw that video. You surprised your parents, and your mom made you dinner, and then you took them camping. I was like, okay, you know too much now. But they're nice. They get that we have a job to do. A few weeks before that, Tom Steyer was in Iowa for the first time, and he spent a lot of money on advertisements in Iowa. So I kept asking him about this. I kept pushing him, and he stuck to his message, and he wouldn't bite. And then afterwards, he goes, "You're very mean, I was like, "I'm mean, but I'm fair, right?" He's like, then he gave me a high five. And so they know that we have a job to do, but it's nice. Sometimes you don't get that human side to them, and a lot of times they present themselves that way when the cameras are off and the sound recorders not recording anymore. They do have a human side to them.
Yeah,
What's the vice president like?
It's very scheduled. Just coming from the White House, right? So he knows, okay, I have to stand here, I have to give my speech. However, the good thing is that I've noticed from beginning, starting to cover him a couple months ago to now, is that his campaign has made him a bit more accessible. They do try and make him gaggle if we're on the road for a week, at least twice a week. Because he's always going to make news. They know that too. He's always someone that we're going to ask a different kinds, all an array of questions. So they do try and make him available. However, those behind the scenes moments of just like, hey, that doesn't necessarily happen a lot because he's done. They say, okay, press, thanks, press, and then they whisk him away, and then he's off to wherever he has to go next. So we don't get as many of those moments, but you do see it at times when you do start hanging out a lot more, simply because you're in the same place. And I'm thinking specifically just this past week at the steak fry, he had a pre-event and we had to walk over to the main event site. And the embeds were always carrying our cameras, and we're the ones feeding that shot directly to the cable news. For us, it's MSNBC, or to NBC for nightly news. And so we have to keep our camera up on him the entire time, and if he's walking this way, that means we're walking backwards to make sure the camera is there. And he was having a good time, he was in a good mood, and at one point he talked to me and one of the other embeds. He's like, you guys, he's always like, be careful, be careful. He's always very cautious about us running into something. But then he said, I don't know how you guys are doing it. I mean, even walking forwards is a little tough. I don't know how you guys do it. And then turns around and starts walking backwards. And he's like, yeah, that's a little hard. And I don't know how you guys are even doing it carrying these cameras. So there are those moments where he knows we're around. He does tease us a little bit. And you do see that personality come out.
Have you seen a difference in him, the Biden we have seen on the debate stage, who's had some okay moments, some good moments, and some tough moments, versus the Vice President Biden in a gaggle, where, my limited view of that is he seems more comfortable with that and more confident and just more at ease with that than he is on the debate stage. Do you see those differences?
Yeah, I do. In a gaggle, I think because a lot of the reporters now that are with him, he knows their faces. He likes to talk a lot, as I think you all know, and that makes it difficult on the debate stage to try and parse down his words to just that 1 minute that they give them. But he's more comfortable. And he's also more comfortable that if he doesn't like a question, he will tell you, or kind of, be a little bit more defensive about it. It is interesting to see. And I think that honestly the reason that is because he's just had a good time talking to a ton of voters. He loves the rope line, and that kind of is his way of decompressing, is just talking to other voters there, kind of mingling with them, and it is reflective of his mood of that day. And you can tell, you're like, oh, he's in a good mood. Oh, okay, today he's not feeling so great, right? And when he gaggles on good days, then yes, he'll take a ton of questions, and when his wrangler says, "Okay, press, thanks, press, or last question, press," he'll be like, "No, I'll keep going. I'll keep taking questions," which makes us happy.
Chelsea, you made a couple of observations when we were talking about what we should talk about tonight, and I wanted to ask you about both of them. One was the interaction with campaign staffs, and as a new reporter on politics, what your sort of take of that was. What did it take to get used to that? And the second is your observation about candidates as human beings, and in a sense the degree to which we don't think about that all the time, that that they're like all the rest of us. They just happen to be running for president of the United States, but they have their own emotions and life experiences, and you get to see that because they're in difficult circumstances a lot of the time. It's emotionally tough, it's physically tough. So talk about both of those if you could.
Yeah, to start with the second, I think we all, before we got out here, were sort of like talking about how tired and bleary-eyed we are, and hopefully we've gotten to do laundry recently, and you think about that grind, and while the candidates are probably on charters and maybe don't have to do the work after the fact, like they are also living that life. And there are times when you can tell they are tired. There are times where they haven't seen their family or their voice is gone. And I think as someone who hadn't done this and sort of had seen these people on TV, yes, they're very, they're put together. Their staffs make sure they have everything they need. They always look put together. And yet that there's times where, they have to roll off a plane and be really not only functional, but sort of engaging and energetic and themselves, because somebody's always seeing them for the first time. I'll speak for myself, there are times where I just try to make sure I'm there and clothed and have everything I need and know what I'm supposed to ask. And that's all I have to do. But if I were to have to talk to a huge group of people, I don't know how I would do it. And, so I think that's been really interesting for me to see the rigors that these people go through, particularly some of the older candidates. I mean, I don't know how they do it. And it's fascinating to me. I think, too, one thing I've learned, particularly in following Harris, is, this is a lot of people's first time running for president, which is, I think, there are, the first time you do anything, and I don't know if you've experienced this on the campaign, but I think there are a lot of people who tell you what to expect and what's probably a good approach. But once you get out there, you still have to find your own way of doing things, and I certainly am finding that. And I think, a lot of these candidates are probably still finding that. And I think, I had a Harris advisor once say to me, the hardest part is sifting through advice. And I think there's a lot of voices in these people's heads at all times. And if you really haven't been through it, or, you're sort of feeling things out, that's probably not easy to deal with either. And one of the moments I won't forget is, I think Harris, I'm not quite sure when this fell, but I think it was after sort of maybe a healthcare mishap where she'd taken some heat the week before, and she ended up in LA for an event, and she's obviously from California, and so she had a really big, friendly crowd, and she got out on stage and was bouncing. It was like she was feeling that, and she didn't really speak for a while, and you could just tell that it actually meant something, in a way, not in a performative way. You can kind of tell when they're, putting on the show, and that was really striking to me. It was like, wow, they like to be liked. It matters to them. And I think that's something that I've seen a lot too. And one of the other examples we talked about is, I'm sure maybe a couple of you were at the gun forum in Des Moines. I don't know where that was, where Andrew Yang, who has not been through this before, is not a career politician, has not had to interact with people and hear their stories like some of these people, heard from a parent who'd lost a child and just started crying. Like he just lost it. And because he was thinking about his own kids, and you're just like, wow, this is really heavy. If you had to go through those rope lines and internalize some of the stories and the desperation that you feel, that would be really hard to shake and would be very, emotionally grueling. So I've been really struck by that aspect of all this. I think sometimes we dehumanize these people, and they are running for the highest office in the land. There's certainly a different standard, but you just forget all the pressures that they're subject to. And to the second point about interacting with campaign staffs, I mean, this is probably fairly obvious, but in baseball, there's a score, right? At the end of the day, you either won or you lost, so you write about that, and there's not a whole lot anyone can say to you, that wasn't fair, we actually won. You're like, no, you didn't. But as you know, in politics, there is no score, right? There are polls, but those are negotiable. And I think something that I have really probably should not have been surprised by, but just have had to learn to navigate, is the extent to which there's interaction with campaign communication staffs over almost everything. Before stories, trying to get them to respond to various questions. After stories, when their opinion differs from what their opinion of the facts is different than yours. And I think there's a lot of push and pull there. These are people you have to see every single day. You want to build trust. You don't want to make them think you're going to do everything they want you to do. You also want to be fair when they make a good argument. And I think that's really hard to navigate. I don't know how that plays out in television. I know you guys take some heat too for questions and things like that, but I know in print it's something that it feels like a constant negotiation in a way that I didn't expect, and I think is a really interesting dynamic, because you see these people as much as you see your family, right? And you do get to sort of learn them and want a good working relationship, but there are times where they're really mad at you and you're really mad at them, and you just have to kind of learn how to pick your battles and navigate for the truest possible thing you can write.
I'm going to turn to you all in a minute. I have one or two more questions, so if you want to begin to line up at the microphones, and we'll get to you in a second. Chelsea, the point you make about sort of the confrontation, there's also the flip side, and Marianna, you probably face this more than some of the others, because you are embedded with Biden. How do you, and you may have the same question, how do you avoid kind of the Stockholm syndrome? The degree to which you become, you're living in the same environment with staff and to some extent with the candidate. And Mark's been through this from the side of a campaign. I've been through it with different campaigns. How do you keep that balance? How do you keep distance and maintain the kinds of relationships you have to maintain in order to do the kind of reporting you have to do? What's that like?
Well, you definitely have to, as we were saying earlier, you definitely have to maintain those relationships. You have to be talking to the campaign. Because if you don't talk to the campaign, and then let's say you tweet something or you write something, they're like, well, why didn't you come to us, right? So you do have to maintain those relationships. I don't know yet about the Stockholm Syndrome, because we haven't necessarily been traveling with the candidate and their staff at all times. So after an event ends, you go your own separate ways. Unless you're going to the same event, you'll see them later. But at events, you say hello, you talk, you try, and it's a friendly relationship, right? And friendly in the sense of like, hey, hello, you're cordial with each other. But there is a mutual understanding, and the campaign has said this as well. Like, we know that if you're talking to them about writing a story, that sometimes we're not going to like the facts, and yes, we might pick up the phone and call you and say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, but that'll be a moment, right? We'll work through it. But I don't know. It's going to be interesting, honestly, if we do start traveling with the campaign, with the candidate. That's really when you're with them at all times, going from point A to point B. But in the moment, I think the best part is actually being able to decompress with your fellow embeds on the road who know exactly what you're going through more than anyone. That is probably the best way to end your days and start your days and get you through the day.
You alluded to the last question I want to ask, and that is just describe what your lives are like on the road. What were your first impressions when you went out? How do you do your travel? How do you pack? What do you do about eating? And when you're on the run all the time, just what's it like? What's the stress of that life like?
It's exciting. It's different for me in Iowa because I'm not flying around everywhere. There's a lot of driving. I just crossed 10,000 miles in the last 4 months. But my approach to it all is I have Cliff Bars everywhere in my camera bag, in my backpack, on both sides of my car, and I will always travel with extra clothes. I will keep a pair of jeans and shirt and socks in my trunk. I also travel with my golf clubs. It's sometimes you find that extra 20 minutes that you can hit up the driving range, and it is a good way to de-stress. And then the other thing that helps is, as you mentioned, talking to fellow embeds, whether it's on other networks or on our own team. And we have a group chat, and it's a great way to just kind of vent, and they understand what you're going through, and it helps to have other people who are kind of in that same boat. Because I can call my parents, but they have no idea what's going on, you know? And then the way our travel works is there's 2 of us in Iowa, so when all the candidates put their schedules out, we make this crazy, weird Google Doc with 8 different colors of who's covering what and where we can get to and how long that drive is, because somebody in DC may not know that it's 4 hours from Dubuque to Sioux City, and that's where we kind of give our input and say, this is what I can get to, and this is where it's also important to have those good, cordial relationships with the campaign teams, because you can call them and say, hey, you've got 3 events today. I may only be able to get to 2 of them. Can you let me know where your candidate is going to speak with the press today? Then I can make that a priority and make sure I'm there. Or which one of these stops are you going to roll out a policy proposal? Then I can make sure that I'm there. Because if they're doing 5 meet and greets in one day, they're giving the same stump speech and taking 3 questions and moving on, then you have to be able to know which one is going to be the most newsworthy and most important to you. So that's kind of my approach to running around all over Iowa.
Chelsea did a video for us on how to pack a suitcase. So
Yeah, it was, well, I was supposed to be giving tips, and instead when that video got published, I received a lot of unsolicited tips about how to pack. So you brought up Sioux City. So my life on the campaign trail, I think it was supposed to start like January 8th, and I think it was like January 4th. They were like, do you want to go to Iowa tomorrow? I was like, sure, like why not? And Elizabeth Warren was going to be out there, and you know, a couple of our other reporters were there, so like you can go out and learn what it's like. And she was going to be in Sioux City, and I was like, okay, I can do this. Like I booked a flight. I was like about to book a flight, and I was like, I don't see any good flights to Des Moines. And they were like, no, you fly into Omaha. I was like, guys, I know I'm new, but I also know that Omaha is Nebraska. Like you can't haze me like this. But then I learned quickly that it was, you know, an hour drive north. But ever since then, my geography of Iowa has improved significantly. For me, I think it's a little different. These guys have it much harder. Some of them will probably tell you that, some of them won't. But they have to carry stuff. They have to be there 2 hours before everything. Like they're kind of herded around and have to get the shot. I don't have to get a shot. You know, I can sneak in and ask a question, or you know, by the time I get into a scrum or a gaggle, one of them has probably already asked it. So you know, we have it a little bit easier. You know, I've definitely had those moments of writing stories in my car by the side of like an Iowa cornfield, and those are always like a little bit of an adventure. You just like double check the locks, even though there's like no humans for 40 miles. But so it's a little bit, it's fraught, I think is probably the best way to describe it. You don't always have time to think or plan, but the travel is definitely intense. I think, covering a few other candidates, I've sort of been, all over the place. But you do get to see a lot of new places. Check off some new states, and you get to see things you would never get to see. Senator Sanders went to the Comanche Nation's annual powwow the other day, and that's just like a world I would never, get an opportunity to be in otherwise. And you just get to see things like that where you just learn so much and so many experiences and historic places, and you meet so many people that you would never encounter. So in that way, it's just like kind of a once in a lifetime way to see America, and it's been really cool. If even if my packing apparently is not as optimized as it could be.
We could all use tips on packing. Let's go to questions. As I said, state your name, where you are here or wherever, and make the question succinct. And if you want to direct it to a specific person, feel free.
Is it on? Oh, it is. Okay. Hi, my name is Nisha Sayed. I'm a first year at the college. So I know obviously journalism and being a reporter isn't always easy. There's some challenges you may face. So have your political views ever challenged your journalistic duties, and how would you overcome that?
It's an interesting question. I think as someone who didn't grow up here, a lot of the issues that seem to always divide Americans weren't a topic of conversation at the dinner table for me and my family, whether it is guns or climate change or whatever. These things, I didn't talk about them at home. For us, these weren't worries. And I think coming from that background, it has allowed me to kind of see both sides of it very clearly, because I wasn't very passionate about them. And so I can see where somebody is making an argument on the left and where somebody's making an argument on the right. And I think it is very important to have that kind of perspective, because sometimes it can be tough, because some of these issues impact all of our lives too. And I think as someone who didn't necessarily talk about them, like growing up for me, it was, okay, I got to get to work, I got to make sure I can put food on the table. That was the worry. We were watching the news, and foreign policy issues were important, but the domestic issues that are so important in day-to-day lives of Americans wasn't a concern. And I think it's been somewhat of a blessing in disguise to not always be conflicted by a viewpoint and not have to choose one side. And it's tough. Like, we all have opinions, we all have our own personal views, but I think from that perspective, I've kind of lucked out a little bit to where I can clearly see both sides of it. And I think it helps me frame my questions to candidates, it helps me frame my questions to voters, and it allows me to talk to voters on all sides. And that's very important, especially because of all the flack that the media got after 2016, not being able to see everybody and hear their opinions and look at their perspectives. So I think that's something that I've tried to do a lot, especially this cycle.
I think it's a responsibility. It's your job, right? And they teach you that in college. And in this landscape, what you're alluding to is people don't trust the press, right? So it's your job description. It's what you have to do. You have to try and gain that trust back. And that's kind of what makes me think about, okay, how am I supposed to frame my questions, or whose voice am I not including? It's just part of who you are. This is, like I said, your job description. This is what you were hired to do. It wasn't to say, okay, that person is right, that person is wrong, or let me tell you what I think. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to tell the story, to hear people out and be able to relay that to those who are listening, and try, and even when people aren't listening, try and let that be out there and make the people make the judgment for themselves.
And I think fortunately at a newspaper we have people whose job it is to draw conclusions and share opinions, and fortunately, that is not mine. So, for me personally, it never even really gets to the point of what I think. It's just so important. And I think maybe partially because I'm, new to it and still catching up, that I am sometimes so concerned about making sure I understand the background and the history and all the arguments on either side, that I'm able to just worry about making sure that I have right what everyone said and how it matters. But I feel very fortunate that it's not my job to share my opinion.
I do get asked that by voters a lot, though. When you're talking, they're like, oh, so what do you think?
Yeah.
And usually my approach to it is telling them what I'm hearing from other voters. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something you can always rely on. Okay, they'll ask you again, well, so what do you think? Or who do you think is going to win? Well, this is what I'm hearing from other voters. This is from what I'm hearing people in Iowa tell me. This is what I'm hearing other strategists that I talk to tell me. And that's always a good fallback, to just go back to what you're hearing and what other people are telling you. Because like you said, that's our job, is to listen and then tell other people what we're hearing. And you try to balance it out on both sides. This is what I'm hearing on this side, and this is what I'm hearing on this side. And that's all you can do.
Up to the balcony.
Hi, my name is Jackson. I'm a senior at the college. And I was wondering, we mainly like to focus on, the national polling numbers and the debates. And I was wondering more along the lines of field organizing. Whose campaign do you think has a strong field organizing, and also especially in the first 4 states, what is that shaping up to look like?
I kind of talked about this earlier. Senator Elizabeth Warren has a really good ground game in Iowa. Mayor Pete Buttigieg just upped his team to nearly 100 staffers. He opened up 20 offices in 20 days. Senator Booker has had about 60 people in Iowa since June. Vice President Biden is now close to 100 or over 100 in Iowa. And as I mentioned, it's not always the number of people you have, it's the quality of people you have, how good they are at going, knocking on doors and convincing people 5-6 months ahead to show up on a cold, nasty February night for you in a place and stand there for 6 hours. And what you see when you talk to people and when you ask them who they're hearing from most, who is calling them the most, it's always Senator Elizabeth Warren's name, at least in Iowa, from what I'm hearing, that comes up a lot, is, hey, we see them everywhere. At the steak fry, for example, everybody else was into the sign wars, bringing out their signs and cheering and having a drum line and dancing. Their team did the complete opposite. They had all their organizers wear blue shirts, and they had balloons tied to them that went up, and so you could see them from far away. You're like, you see a balloon, oh, that's a Warren organizer. And they took this opportunity where you have 12,000 active Democrats in the state all in one place. That's a very rare opportunity. And so while everybody else is doing the cheering, doing the dancing, putting their signs in your face, they're going around talking to people, getting their information, making sure they're following up with them. And so that was very interesting to see. Senator Bernie Sanders did the same thing. All the campaigns paid $2,500 to buy a rally spot. Only 10 campaigns were able to buy them, only 10 rally spots there were available. A couple campaigns bought 2 of them, and Sanders just put a door at their rally spot and said, we're out door knocking. So everybody else started at their rally spot, did a little spiel, and then marched in. And so those two kind of took a different approach to it, and that kind of stuff stands out. But that was also an opportunity for campaigns to show, make a lot of noise, show the kind of support they have. And so when I saw, especially the balloons, because you could see them from far away, it was an interesting strategy, at least in Iowa.
I think one of the ones that's really interesting is both in Iowa and also South Carolina, Booker's staff often comes up as, when you ask people, like, who do you hear from, who's around? Like, they have a really big presence. And so it continues to be a little bit baffling that while he hasn't had the major moment, he also hasn't had, any major, gaffes or anything. And despite having what people describe as very powerful ground organizations, they haven't been able to really catch on. But he's another one that comes up. But I know, Sanders already had sort of the really big kind of infrastructure from 2016, but I think, everyone talks about Warren, and that's pretty all over the place. The one that I don't have a clear sense of is Nevada, and I think that one feels like it's pretty up for grabs.
Yeah.
Let's go up here.
Hi, my name is Meena Venkataraman. I'm a junior at the college, and my question is, in the wake of the whistleblower complaint, we've seen Donald Trump pivot to this story that's unsubstantiated about alleging corruption in the Biden family, and especially as it relates to leveraging his influence as vice president in Ukraine. But in 2016, Trump did a similar thing where he also alleged that Hillary Clinton was entrenched in a corrupt system and used the emails and the private email server to circulate that narrative. So my question for you is, to what extent do you think, simply by virtue of this narrative being circulated in the media about the whistleblower complaint, do you think it could possibly have the opposite effect on Trump voters, where they're now pivoting and clutching to this narrative of corruption among the Biden family? I don't know if you've seen it in the people you've talked to, or do you suspect to see that they are going to start clinging to this unsubstantiated narrative that could devolve into conspiracy?
Marianna, you want to deal with that?
Sure. I think the one thing about Trump voters that I think even post the 2016 election that we've seen is that Trump voters are Trump voters, right? Like, he can do anything and they'll still be with him. I think it's going to be the middle ground, for the people who didn't really like Hillary Clinton, didn't really like Trump, where are they going to be getting their information from, right? So that is the kind of scenario where we have the responsibility to say, okay, the Trump campaign is saying X, but really this news organization, that news organization, this organization has proven otherwise, or this is what really was happening in that moment. So that is our big responsibility moving forward, and the story is not going to go away. So it's still too early, I think, to get a sense from voters where they fall on this. Biden actually is not necessarily on the road too much this week, but that is something that the moment that we start going out with him again, that's a question that we're going to ask all the people who are at his events.
Right. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Randy Feldman. I'm an immigration lawyer, and I audit classes here at the school. In White House tradition, I had a question and a follow-up. The question is, when a candidate is giving their stump speech, whether they use a loose leaf and they read it and look up, or whether they use the teleprompter, or whether they're spontaneous, can you tell us a little bit about what it's like, how it's different when you see them do it in different ways? And secondly, was a little something about that, Kimberly, you were talking about earlier, is Republicans oftentimes accuse the press of being primarily Democrats. Beyond politics and one's predisposition, one's subjective life and how you might interpret facts on your own, how do you evaluate what's a fair interpretation of facts and try not to just be yourself or just be your political predisposition and decide how to write or what clip to use or how you're going to interpret things for the general public?
To the first question about stump speeches, Senator Harris is one of the most sort of dogged, I'm going to stick to what I know I'm supposed to say. And so it felt like for 5 months, my only job was to listen to whatever was different, and often there wasn't anything. But at one point, she got really excited, and it was like a Saturday night in Vegas. There's a very excited crowd, and she said, like, dude gotta go about the president. And people started chanting it, and then all of a sudden it was like, that line worked. So she started using it again and again. And sometimes it would land and sometimes it wouldn't. But it happened just enough that she'd keep trying. And it was so funny to watch her campaign as she would do that, just be like, oh gosh, here we go again, And eventually they just wrote it in and let it be a part of the speech because she liked it so much. But it is funny to watch, you do hear the same thing every day. And I think it's hard to not disengage, but the differences are so important because of that. And I've also, Senator Sanders is a little more agile in the way he approaches it, at least recently. But, there's things you learn to listen for. But I don't know what your experience has been. But it is kind of funny to notice when they change something or, that always means something because it doesn't happen very often. Yeah, I think Biden, he has his stump speech. But again, he really likes to talk. So you see a big difference when he has a teleprompter versus when he doesn't. And sometimes he'll have a teleprompter but totally disregard it and just start talking. Like he knows the points he has to hit, but it just takes some time, if not sometimes more than others, to get there. And so a lot of the press is like, okay, all right, okay, you made that point, okay. And then it's funny because he'll say, and lastly, but it's actually not the end. But it's true. The moment that they insert something different or say something differently, there was one speech that he gave very quickly, I believe it was South Carolina Democratic Convention, and he's just talking quickly because it was a timed speech, and then he just basically lays out this criminal justice reform plan that we knew was coming but didn't know how soon it was coming, and we were all like, oh, that's new, okay, that's new. So playing a lot of catch up and knowing the stump speech really helps flag those moments.
Hi, I'm Alex Chan. I'm a first year at the college, and my question for you is, what advice do you have for someone who might be interested in going to journalism?
I don't know.
Don't tweet anything.
Careful
don't
when you
tweet.
Find a way to get involved early. If you like to write, find a way to write. If you like to make videos, start doing that. I was really interested in making videos, so I would play around on iMovie on my MacBook. Just go to class, take a camera from the school's department, go around, shoot stuff, and put a video together. That's kind of what got me into television world. there's a school newspaper. Get involved with that. Whatever it is, just the earlier you can get involved, the better. And look at the different roles that other people play and find a way to be useful. Like you can have internships, you can have all this different skills, but if you're not useful, then it's not going to help anybody out. And if you're useful to somebody in a newsroom, then you're very valuable to them. Then they can't let you go. Then they have to keep promoting you. And I think that's a good lesson for life in general. Just find a way to be useful, find a way to be helpful, and be nice to people. You never know when you're going to run into somebody again somewhere else. We're all in this together. We're all trying to get the same thing done. So you're going to run into people all over and again. And whether it's somebody at one news organization, they move on to another. And that's the same thing when we deal with campaign staffers. A campaign crashes and dies, and then that staffer goes on to another campaign. And if you've had that good relationship, that's very helpful. So be useful and be nice to people, and don't forget the people who help you out.
I would say something that I did and I recommend any student doing is intern, but don't get discouraged if you don't get the best internship your first try or the third try. My first internship was actually at the police department in Tampa because I couldn't find an internship, and they just they had a spare camera and they let me just talk to people about policing, right? So it's just getting those little groundworks of okay, how do I ask a question? How do I use a camera, right? It helps you, it gives you those opportunities to make some mistakes, but also learn a ton. And then once you start to intern, you can go, you start building your resume a little bit, but I think the most important thing out of all of that is the connections that you make. A ton of people that I interned with now, I work alongside with on the campaign trail from other networks, and they just become your friends. So you never know when those people are going to come back into your life, and you'll learn a lot from them and your experiences.
We are basically out of time, but let's do one more question.
Hi, my name is Blake. I'm a sophomore here at the college. I know that y'all get to talk to the candidates a lot, but I'm sure you also get to talk to voters in these early primary states a lot, and voters in a lot of swing states that may not be involved in the caucus or primary process. With the House likely to begin impeachment proceedings and polling showing that's extremely unpopular among most Americans, what is your sense of the pulse of the Americans in these states about how they feel about this?
It doesn't come up much in Iowa. When you talk to voters, impeachment is not the first thing that's on their mind. It's the day-to-day issues that they're concerned about. It's healthcare, it's climate change, it's guns. That's what they care about. Democratic voters that I talk to, at least they will talk about the most important thing for them is making sure that they unseat President Trump. Whether that is through impeachment or through beating him in the election, that's important to them. So in July, when the Mueller testimony was happening, I was in a small town, Iowa, and it was the first time impeachment had come up, and there was a book club that was reading the Mueller report, and there was 20 of them in this club, and I was like, oh my God, this is great. They had the printed out copies, and they would meet after their county meetings, and they had just finished it up. So that was the first time that I had come across it. But what's interesting about Iowa is 31 of the 99 counties voted for President Obama twice and then voted for President Trump. There are over 700 counties across the country called the pivot counties that went that way. And so I spent an afternoon, outside of Cedar Rapids, there's a women's club. They're part of the National Federation of Women's Club. They meet once a month from April to September. And a lot of these women voted for President Obama twice and then President Trump. And I just sat down in a living room with them, drinking iced tea and eating cookies, talking about this, and not once impeachment came up. And this is what you were talking about earlier, is the voters who supported President Trump. There were a few in this group who would word by word repeat lines that he had said at rallies or at tweets about different issues, and whether it was concerns about tariffs. There are a lot of farmers who are being hit hard with his policies, and there were a couple of women who were farmers here. They didn't care. They were like, it doesn't matter. We love him. We're going to support him. whereas the Democrats were somewhat concerned, but I think they were weary of going towards impeachment, because then if the Senate doesn't indict him and he can go out and be like, I'm innocent. Look, nothing happened. They tried impeachment, they failed at that, and gonna go campaign on that. So it doesn't come up as much as you think it would in Iowa.
I remember, like, right after the Mueller stuff happened, after the report came out, obviously we were listening for it, and I went like 3 days before I heard a Mueller question from a voter. Most of the questions came from us, so I thought that was really interesting. I think, at least following Democrats in early states, Democratic voters are pretty much clear on their stance about President Trump. And so I think one woman said to me and then just like walked away, and I was like, okay, she's like, wake me up when it matters. And I was like, okay. But I think that's sort of the vibe, right, with impeachment, is like, if it, we just want him gone. And so if this does it, great. If it's the election, great. But like, we've heard about all this stuff for so long and it never seems to add up, is sort of the feeling that I've heard from a lot of people. And it is interesting, and hard to believe, I think, but it really doesn't seem to be like, maybe it'll change, but it doesn't seem to be like at the forefront of people's minds, because the lines are drawn and sort of the conclusions have been drawn with them.
Chelsea, you get the last word. This has really been fun and interesting, and I hope you all have a better appreciation for the hard work that people like these three go through, but also what they're able to see and observe and experience. It's a tremendous experience for them, but what they give back to viewers and readers and to your correspondents is also tremendous. So please give them a big hand.